All right, we'll understand if some people sneak in and out to get that second cup of coffee as they're just rolling it out right now. All right, want to keep us on schedule here. So I'd like to introduce Jeff Urnaza, who is the Director of Engineering at Fortinet, who's going to talk to us about cybersecurity in a hybrid world. So.
Thank you, Andy. Hopefully everyone got some more caffeine and energized, because I think I'm one of two groups that are standing in front of you in some lunch. So a little background about myself. Full disclosure, I'm a vendor, 20 years in the industry, but I spent 75% of my time actually working for a global Fortune 500 organization, actually working for Mark Van Holzbeck right here. So I think I come with a little bit of street cred in the enterprise space. So what I want to kind of talk to you guys about is hybrid cloud, automation, DevOps, cybersecurity, how all those things fit together, right? And the first question that popped into my head when I started thinking about that was this question right here. It's difficult. Why is it difficult? But then when I thought about it more, it's actually why I love my job, because my job continually changes and evolves as time goes by, right? We see a trend come out, we see a new emerging threat that comes out. What do? We evolve, we close that gap, and we move forward, right? And it's a continuous life cycle that we go through in security. And it's what makes my job interesting, but it's also what makes your jobs hard, right? Because once you close that gap, you have to move on to the next. And how do you deal with that? How do you adjust to that? And so what happens is, this is from a company called Momentum Cyber. They call it the Cyberscape. And I'm sure everyone has talked to at least one person, one vendor on here, and you're looking at something in all of these areas. And this is exactly what makes your world so complex and difficult, is because you have all of these people to talk to, and I'm one of them. And you're trying to get your arms around all this. You're trying to calm together through all this data and figure out, how do I actually have an effective security policy and controls in place around all of this? What do I do? How do I make myself effective? How do I have the best use of my time and budget that I have to put towards all of this? What this ends up being for most organizations is it ends up being a digesting of tools. When I would hire a new engineer at Avery, I would block out 2 weeks of my calendar to sit down and go through tools that they had to learn to use, right? And I'm sure every enterprise goes through that, going, here's the tools that we've chosen to use, here's how you get this data, here's how you implement this policy, and you go through all of these steps. And in today's world, with all the threats that are out there and how everything is gone, the average enterprise is looking at 75 plus tools inside of their organization. Now, from my perspective, I think that should be less, right? But how do we get to that point? How do we consolidate that down? How do we reduce that number and simplify that world? So first, we need some focus, right? We need to find some key areas that everyone needs to look at and figure out a strategy. And in some of the conversations that I had at breakfast and going on, everyone's already looking at some of all these areas, so I don't think this should be too much shocking to these areas, right? But we'll see how we tie it all together, right? So number one, consolidation. Consolidation is the name of the game, right? As an emerging technology comes out, it emerges, we find a point solution for it, and we eventually collapse that down into a product. I would argue that the time frame for that consolidation is too slow in today's marketplace. And what I mean by that is, the reason why you have this scope creep, why you have this volume of tools that's happening in the industry, is because you need to integrate that point solution in 1 to 2 years' time into your platform. And that integration isn't going to happen in the industry with the larger players for 3 to 5 years. Because that company, that startup has to grow, that acquisition has to happen, it has to come into the fold before it gets integrated into the larger tool sets that you have inside your organization. And by that time, it's too late. You've had that scope creep of all those tools. Your tool set's grown to that mass, that 75 that we're talking about, right? So why not look at a platform approach where the integration is done by those vendors for you, for your benefit, and it can be done day one, where they learn to talk to each other in a normalized language, where they can actually give you that exchange of threat intelligence and act as a single product, even though you have multiple products that are implemented. I heard someone on one of the panels call it, the soft watermelon, right? Everyone's network in the early 2000s was a hard, crusty shell on the outside and a soft middle. What did we learn from that? We learned that you need to collapse things down. You need to put in internal segmentation firewalls. You need to have control points in your network. But one of the things that comes when you segment your network is complexity from an operations perspective, right? Operations has more tasks that they have to deal with, right? Because for a simple engineer to say, I need something to go from A to B, it used to just be we go to the perimeter firewall and we allow it. And now with internal segmentation, it's I go to these 8 firewalls that I have to go through before it egresses out, right? So operations gets bogged down in that process, right? And when we get a little forward here, we'll talk about how the fabric can help enable that for you as well. Things are converging, right? I come from Avery, as a background, a manufacturing company. We understand OT, we understand SCADA. We know it's out there as a manufacturing organization. But OT has emerged out into all organizations now. Everywhere I go and take a meeting, I go in a meeting room, someone waves their badge and it automatically reserves that room for them. All the lighting and HVAC systems are online and controlling those organizations. All of those things are running some form of an embedded operating system, usually Linux. And I can guarantee you the developers of that product, security was not in the forefront of their mind when they developed that tool. So how do we get our arms around this OT environment that's out there and collapse that down and have a control point around it? I heard some folks talk about protection and how that has to evolve, right? And in my mind, detection and protection, they are the first wall, that first stopgap, but what we really need to be is we need to have a response. And that response has to be automated so that once we see that we're actually blocking something, we actually have the ability to go out and put an automatic control point around that. And what I mean by that is, if I see a compromise at a network level, does my system, do my tool sets have the ability to automatically go to the wireless network that person's connected at and quarantine them and disconnect them? Can I go to their endpoint agent and lock them down and disconnect them from the network if they're connected from a VPN? Do I have that end-to-end control through all of these systems? Integration. How many folks around here are looking at SD-WAN solutions today? I would imagine at least someone at each table probably is looking at an SD-WAN solution. One of the things that's happening in the SD-WAN industry, right, is there's the innovators, there's the startups that are out there, right, that are going and saying, we have an SD-WAN solution, and it's a solution that stands on its own. Others are developing it from within the organization, the legacy telco kind of environment. From my perspective as a security practitioner, I call it secure SD-WAN is what I look at. And people have to understand that when you start integrating this stack down, security and threat intelligence actually has to be part of that solution now, because one of the end states of SD-WAN is what? Low latency internet access, right? Because you're moving to a hybrid cloud environment. So now your end users want low latency, high speed internet access. But that also means that security stack that you have actually needs to move much closer to the user now, because you have internet access points that used to be maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 points in the world. If you're a large global company, you now have hundreds of these access points around the world where people are actually ingressing and egressing out of your network. All of this leads to automation. I've heard a lot of people talk about automation within their development processes. When I talk about automation, I'm talking about automation in your security processes. And can you actually have an automated response to an action that happens on your network, right? I see a system that changed state. When that state happens, can I launch an investigation onto it automatically? Can I automatically open up a ticket and and bring someone in to do an investigation in a system. If I see certain types of alerts that correlate together with a number of systems that are crown jewels to me, can I automatically block that and initiate an investigation as part of that, right? All of this requires traditionally DevOps. But when we talk about a security fabric, the security fabric will actually give you the foundation to do that and do it in a much more simple form. And we'll step into that a little bit on the next slides. Cloud, everyone's favorite topic, right? Private, public cloud, hybrid cloud, IaaS, SaaS, right? We've all heard all of those technologies. We've looked at all of them. We're using them all. I think a lot of organizations I've heard have a cloud-first initiative. One of the things I see that as I watch the maturity of organizations that I talk to is very quickly cloud-first becomes hybrid cloud. And then hybrid cloud, which started out as 1 to 2 strategic vendors that they were talking about, turns into, well, we still have our private cloud, then we have this cloud vendor, and we have this cloud vendor for this other business unit, and very quickly, it starts to scatter out, which it used to be, I have a one cloud strategy, right? I talked to a lot of organizations that we're moving everything to AWS, or we're moving everything to Azure. But then you find that what's going on in these environments is, I call them padded rooms, right? Where you had all the freedom to build out your architecture inside your data center and support all of your apps. When you move into a cloud environment, it's a padded room. That vendor is limiting how you do things and what you can do with it. So your development teams probably come back and go, well, we can't use this vendor because they don't support this, so we're going to use this product. And that's how you get that scatter that happens out across all these environments. What does that do? Now you have a lack of what I call feature parity across all of these environments, right? Because one environment might be more mature from a security perspective than another as far as what that vendor gives you. And part of what we'll move on here through is the security fabric can help you solve that as well, because we can actually implement that feature parity across all these multiple vendors. Everyone's favorite topic, compliance, right? Everyone has an auditor that's coming around and asking, are you compliant? And you have to have a way to score yourself on it. In my days of Sarbanes-Oxley, it was, we create all the tests and execute on them and then present them back to the auditor. Today, with today's regulation compliance and where it vastly changes between the US versus Europe and where you're at, compliance is number one. And I think compliance should be an ongoing score. You shouldn't have to have someone go spend a couple of days to develop a report for you and say, here, this is what we're passing on to our auditors. You should actually be able to look at your compliance over time and say, when we rolled out this application, how did our compliance state change as part of that? Why? Because you rolled out more servers and services, you implemented firewall policy, you stood up new hosts on your network. All of those are going to change the compliance level of your network. And can you score that over time and ensure that the teams that are working inside your organization are driving towards the same metric of ensuring your compliance? And how do you score that over time? If you have 75 tools, that's 75 different touch points that you have to go to figure out, am I or am I not compliant? So what is this security fabric approach that I'm talking about? It relies on something called REST. Not that kind of REST. I wish I got more of that kind of REST. REST API. What REST API is think of it as a two-way street between multiple vendors to communicate, right? So now we publish an API, another partner of ours publishes an API, and now we can develop against those APIs independently to have interoperability between our products. Anyone who has a DevOps team in-house knows exactly what this is and what I'm talking about. And this is what it looks like to them, right? It's a bunch of code, it's a bunch of scripting, but this is complex and hard to do, right? If you don't have the budget to have your own dedicated DevOps team that has a Perl and Python Ninja inside of your organization to write this code, what I'm talking about seems kind of fictional and difficult to do. And you go, how could I accomplish that? But let's take a step back. Everyone inside of the organization It's table stakes today that you have network security, right? You have firewalls, you have routers, you have switches, you have all these components that are inside of your network. But now, we've moved into a hybrid cloud world where we've said, okay, we're going to push these services out at a lower cost into these cloud environments. We're going to subscribe to these SaaS solutions so that we don't have to host these things inside anymore. So now you just fractured your environment that you used to have control around. You've now moved it out into another area. So there, I heard some people talk about multiple enforcement points. But with those multiple enforcement points, you now have multiple places you have to implement that policy. So how do we get our arms around that so that we can actually go back to a board and say, our policy is uniform across the whole organization. What we're enforcing in our legacy data centers is the same thing that we're enforcing in AWS, is the same thing we're enforcing in Azure. How do we do that? Because the tool sets vary across all of them. Each of those vendors gives you a different configuration window, a different level of capabilities that you can actually leverage. On top of that, the evolving threat landscape and ATP and all those things out there have forced us to go and build out a whole other level of tool sets that complement that traditional network security that we had. We've had to go out and buy email security, right? Because we've heard everything is coming through phishing, right? That is the number one way of people coming around and bypassing your network security is by going out and sending those crafted emails to convince somebody to go and download something and effectively bypass that firewall and bring it into the network. Everyone is looking at wireless, right? We've moved towards a wireless world where people are no longer wanting to sit in front of a computer that's physically plugged into the wall, right? I guarantee everyone here has their mobile phones, their iPads, and their wireless devices, and they're connecting to a network, and they're moving transparently across the UCLA network back to their home office and so forth, right? How do we wrap our arms around that access and ensure we have control around that? So we've had to go out and put tools and control points in there. Because of all that flexibility of connectivity we have, endpoint, which used to be table stakes, all of a sudden became a point of innovation, right? We've seen lots of innovation that's happened in the endpoint game as far as having AI and threat intelligence that we push all the way down to the endpoint to protect assets. Why have we had to do that? Because connectivity is everywhere. LTE, wireless broadband is everywhere. People can easily connect. So for you to get your arms around these things inside of your organizations, you've had to put a lot of your control points down on the endpoint. But does that endpoint solution talk to the network solution? Do you actually have the exchange of threat intelligence across all of these? So how do we do that? How do we enable that? How do we, Fortinet, and how do other vendors out there inside of this cyber landscape help enable you to do that? Well, number one, we publish open APIs. What that does is it gives each of us a standard to develop against. I was talking to someone earlier. I have a background in implementing ERP systems for a larger part of my career. And one of the kind of things we would joke about with ERP systems is once we released it to the community, it was effectively defunct, right? Because the business required us to customize it so much. Once patch 1 came out, we had to go right back to step 1 and start re-implementing that system all over again because a business unit said that menu has to say this and it has to do this, so please customize it, right? Well, that makes your life hard. It makes it difficult for you to iterate versions and keep things current, right? We're all trying to patch vulnerabilities, move systems forward to keep them compliant and reduce the vulnerability in that threat landscape that we have. If you have to go and customize all these integrations, that makes it difficult for you to actually do that iteration, right? But what if we, the vendors, take onus of that for you? What if we say, we're going to publish this API, we're going to develop to this API, and we're going to ensure the compliance of that and make sure it's a two-way street for you. And that ensures that when I'm on 5.6 and I publish 6.0 and the other vendor's on 4.5 and they publish 4.7, our teams took the onus to make sure that those APIs and those integrations actually still communicate and work as you rev your software, right? There's no reason for you to re-implement those integrations and have to go back and circle back and redo work you already did inside your organization. The other thing is we can build connectors for you, right? that vendor on the other side of the fence may not want to integrate with us. They might be a direct competitor. But can I go and create a connector that allows me to go into their API that's published and pull data out for you that allows you to have a street that reaches out, touches that data, and pulls it into your network, right? So we can publish those connectors for you to allow you to do that integration from your perspective, even if they're not coming to us and wanting to participate as part of a fabric alliance. So what does this do? This makes the information security team very happy because now they have effectively a single pane of glass view of what's going on in their network end to end. There might be operationally multiple tools inside of the organization, but the exchange of threat intelligence, the awareness of what's going on that all those tools see, is actually shared by this whole fabric. And so I'll give you kind of a walkthrough example, right? You might have a guest network inside of your organization where you allow someone to go to the front desk and get a temporary user ID and pass to connect to your wireless network. Do you know if that system's compliant? Do you know what malware may or may not be on that system? No. So potentially that system could come in and connect and rattle around on that network and whatever access it has and actually be infecting other hosts. With this tool, with the tool sets disconnected, you might have only seen that if somebody went to go look at just the firewall that protects the egress point of that wireless network. But when you have a fabric that's connected, all these systems see it, that gets rolled up to the top level of that fabric, and you can actually have built-in workflows and automation that would automatically quarantine and segment that person off to ensure that they're not infecting other hosts on your network that you might have been given access to. And we'll step into this a little bit further through here. The other thing is network operations benefits and wins from this, because I mentioned before, we're all trying to put segmentation inside of our network. We know we have to do that to protect our systems, right? But that makes policy complex and hard. How do I actually allow someone to go from A to B when it has to go through 8 different devices and I need a policy to actually do that, right? Well, when you have a fabric that's talking to each other like this, we can actually take that policy and take business language and use that big business language to actually implement policy across the fabric, right? So that we actually, instead of implementing policy on an individual device, what I'm talking about is actually take that policy up a tier and actually implement policy on the fabric and have the fabric understand what your business processes look like and know that these ERP systems have to talk to all these other systems. We know the identity and the origin of where these systems are, and we automatically allow that flow across this fabric because we have this level of communication in that fabric. In turn, we also have the ability that when we find something that's vulnerable inside of that data center, we can also automatically quarantine off that single host, right? So if you're using kind of an SDN solution like OpenStack, OpenFlow, NSX, Cisco ACI, all of those are partners that talk to this fabric. Now, when we see a host that maybe gets a piece of malware and an endpoint agent says, hey, red flag, I'm compromised, and normally that would kick off a ticketing process and incident response, and someone goes and investigates, oh, yep, this host is really compromised. Now I'm going to pull it off the network. That's a little too late in my mind, right? I want that thing off the network instantaneously. The moment we found it, I want to shut down communication, quarantine it, and then have someone go and remediate it, right? But when that endpoint solution talks to the fabric and informs the fabric, hey, there's a problem here that I need to be aware of, now it can actually go in and automatically go to the network systems and say, quarantine this host right now, and implement policy on your network automatically. So your network now becomes dynamic to the threats that you have inside of your organization, end to end. But then how does this work with the cloud, right? I'm sure you're all kind of thinking, that's great, but that's all the infrastructure that I have in-house, right? How do we do this when we talk about the cloud and we're in a hybrid environment? And this is where I was talking about there's a problem right now, and the problem is that you don't have feature parity across these environments. when I go and I meet with organizations and I talk about what does your security policy look like and what cloud platforms are you looking at, and I have some of my engineers dig through into those further layers, we always find differentiation between those platforms, what level of what I'll call security maturity those organizations have from one platform to the other, right? They might have really sound AWS profiles set up for all their servers to lock them down and ensure that only the limited amount of communication is happening. But the application owners in Azure couldn't figure out how to make that work. So they just created a very open policy and put the server out there because they had a deadline, right? And so there I just kind of mapped out two different extremes. We have someone who's locked down and secure, and we have someone that just opened up the whole front door because they needed to meet a deadline, right? How do we normalize that out and ensure that across the board we actually have a uniform policy of an enforcement across all these platforms, right? And also, how do we tie that back to our internal policy and profiles as well, so that we can say the same level of security I have in my legacy data center in AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle is all the same, right? Well, you can deploy instances inside of those platforms, right? And if those instances are capable of communicating with the security fabric, they're also capable of enforcing that same business language level of enforcement that I was talking about from a policy perspective, right? And so now they are actually integrating and participating in that fabric and in that awareness of what's going on in your network. And that also means that if you get compromised or you have an issue in any of these cloud platforms, the awareness of that also rolls back down into your legacy platforms as well. But what does this look like from a workflow perspective? This is still going to exist in that world. This won't go away. There's always going to be an ad hoc use case where someone's going to go and write a script for you to enable something. This is a script I actually wrote for a customer because before the concept of a fabric existed, they wanted to block all Tor exit nodes from communicating with all their hosts. So I said, great. I can go write you a script that's going to go and grab all that data and pump it into your system. Boom, you have awareness of it. This is always going to happen. Everyone's going to have a unique case. But if we're going to truly enable the enterprise and enable the environment, in my mind, what we really need to do from an infrastructure perspective is we need to have a security automation engine that enables that organization. Anyone in here familiar with a little app called If This Then That? Anyone? You're all DevOps programmers. I don't know if you realize that. What I'm talking about is exactly what If This Then That is, but for infrastructure. Because in If This Then That, you're going and saying, every time my friend tags me on Facebook, download the photo and stick it into my Google Photos, right? You just did DevOps. But it was simple, right? My 9-year-old son can do it on his iPad. And why was it simple? It was simple because someone gave you an automation engine underneath it to enable you all to be DevOps developers. So what would that kind of engine look like? What kind of things do we need to look at on a network to enable you to do these kind of things? Well, on the left there, we need to have a trigger. Something's happening, and I want to know about it, and I want it to trigger some sort of action to happen, right? So we as vendors, as part of building this security fabric to enable you, as you find new triggers and new things that you want to look at, we have to have a way of delivering those triggers to you and finding that interesting little nugget, that diamond in the rough that you want to have some sort of action taken. In the middle of that, that's the secret sauce, right? That's the automation engine. That's the direct connection into our platform where we understand the trigger that you asked us to identify, and we know how to normalize that into our environment. And then the third piece is what do you want to do with it? And it's very simple, right? You might, on the left there, have detected a compromised host. That fabric now knows, in through its automation engine, this is what that looks like. This is how I talk to all these systems to identify that compromised host. And then you've asked me to do something with that compromised host. You might have said, you know what? Quarantine that person and notify. And so through 3 simple steps there, you effectively did DevOps inside your organization. You didn't have to go hire a team of developers to go and do that. You don't have to worry when you rev software of these automation scripts breaking, right? All of this is maintained for you as an actual service that's published back to you. So let's take a deeper dive into what this would look like inside of an environment. Who here has a sandbox technology inside of the organization? Good. A lot more hands need to go up for that one, right? The next-gen firewall is no longer enough at this point, right? ATP is where it is at to get past your firewall. The reason is we've moved from dealing with something that was known to dealing with something that's unknown, right? And sandboxing is where that happens, right? And it's very easy for hackers to evade you and bypass that technology. Because the next question I'm going to ask, who here is doing SSL man in the middle of all of their traffic? Even fewer hands came up. What percentage of your traffic do you think is encrypted with SSL? I heard 95%, right? The numbers are high, right? Why is that? I call it the Snowden effect, right? Before Snowden, 20% of traffic was encrypted, 80% I'm sorry, 20% was encrypted, 80% was unencrypted. Almost overnight, all the big tech companies flipped the switch and started encrypting all of their data flows. And so now most organizations I go into, good security practices, right? You're encrypting all of your traffic, you're using SSL. But from an InfoSec perspective, from an operations perspective, what have you done? You've actually put blinders on, right? Because if you're not doing SSL man in the middle, it means that next-gen firewall, it means all that technology that you have in place isn't actually looking at anything because it can't see inside of that data flow. So that's why SSL man in the middle and sandboxing are areas that you really need to be aware of and looking at in this environment. And so if we fast forward and bring everyone into that level of maturity inside of the physical network, you're going to end up with a couple of things, right? Number one, on your left side there, you're going to have some security infrastructure, right? You're going to still have your traditional next-gen firewalls. You're going to have some URL content filtering systems. You're probably going to have some DLP and SSL concentrators and so forth to deal with all this. And on the right, you've got your endpoint. Well, when they can communicate with each other, either initiated from the left or the right, someone's going to find a piece of malware. And the first thing that endpoint agent or that infrastructure is going to do is it's going to send it to the sandbox. And it's going to get back a result. Very simply, it's a 1 or a 0. Is this good or is this bad? Now, if you didn't have a fabric and these systems weren't communicating with each other, it would effectively stop there. And you would probably kick off an incident response process to say, let's go look and see why did we see this piece of malware. But by then, it might have been actually too late. That stuff was already rattling around in your network, and that compromise might have gone further into your organization. The same thing could be initiated from an endpoint, right? We all have to travel for work, right? Who's connected to an airport Wi-Fi, Starbucks Wi-Fi, any of those things? Those are points of compromise where hackers are actually putting up fictitious SSIDs for you to connect to so they can act as a man in the middle to infect you. So you might be walking around with a piece of malware you picked up along your travels and you come back in the network and now you put in a submission and you get a result. And again, good on the sandbox. It told you that's bad and you start blocking it. But wouldn't it be great if those systems could actually talk to each other and share that threat intelligence and actually update each other? So the moment you had ground zero on that one endpoint that came into the network, it automatically created a signature for the whole security fabric of how to identify what was previously a piece of unknown malware that was a 0-day no one had seen before. Even better, let's have that threat intelligence go up into the cloud. And you can act as a good net neighbor and actually share that threat intelligence with everyone else. And if your fabric is taking a feed from these subscriptions, from this threat intelligence, you now automatically know about what was once unknown, and it's become known. So in this world that I envision, being infected with a 0-day is like winning the lottery. Because the likelihood of you being ground zero for that piece of unknown malware is minuscule, because all of these systems are sharing this threat intelligence. So Fortinet, where I work, we were one of the founding members of the CTA, the Cyber Threat Alliance. And one of the foundational components of that is when we discover things inside of our ecosystem, we roll that up into the CTA. And everyone else who is a participant with the CTA does the same. And what we're doing is we're exchanging the IOCs, we're exchanging that threat intelligence, because we all want to up our game. Why? For the benefit of you, our customer, and the benefit of our net neighbors, right? So this is my literal only marketing product slide on here, but I like it because it's not really talking about Fortinet products. It's talking about everyone who partners with this fabric that we've built. These are all partners today that if you go to our website, they have a documented integration where they partner and integrate into this security fabric and the foundation that we've created as part of this methodology. And you'll notice they've kind of all broken themselves out into particular areas, right? And it's meaningful, and it's meaningful because we provide them a API touch point for each of these areas, right? If you're a SIM and we're exchanging log data, you're really only interested in that type of data set, right? So we publish an API for them to develop against. If you're identity management, cloud, SDN, virtualization, endpoint, right? We're giving them a touch point into that environment. So if I circle back to my whole concept here, right? What was I talking about? I was talking about everyone has 75 plus tools, right? I was talking about you need to consolidate and you need to simplify your world. But you're all probably looking to consolidate by waiting for your key vendors to actually bring that technology into the fold of what they have. And that's going to take 3 to 5 plus years for that to happen. In the world I envision, that can happen in weeks if they're motivated to integrate, right? The one integration on here with Cisco for their Cisco ACI, that whole integration took 2 weeks to do. When we published the API for the fabric and the Cisco ACI guys got excited about it, development teams got together, went through the API documentation, boom, integrate it, right? So if vendors are motivated, that can be done very quickly. And that means a new emerging technology that you were maybe holding back on or waiting because you didn't want to add yet another tool set to your environment, maybe doesn't have to wait 3 to 5 years for you to have that technology inside of your organization, right? You could have it today. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Just one question. I wanted to ask you, in the 20 years of experience you had, you had a lot of experience. How many of the solutions that you came up with were anticipatory, that you saw a problem looming and you said, let's get ready for it? And how much was just reacting to something that happened you couldn't actually anticipate?
I would say, honestly, it's about 80-20. I'd say 80.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is when I was given a driver of a problem we needed to solve, a thing that was happening inside the organization, how much of the time was it happening and I was responding versus proactively going up, anticipating it, right? And I would say that's probably 80-20, right? Most
80 is responding.
correct. And the reason is correct.
Don't you think we should reverse it?
Absolutely agree with it.
So all you have to do.
The key thing behind there is what's the business driver and investment in InfoSec inside that organization, right? And I'll use two very different analogies, right? So if your business is technology and 95% of people that work inside your organization have to do with technology, and I'm talking about Google, Apple, Microsoft, right? How much budget do you think those folks get for InfoSec? It's almost limitless, right? Because it damages their brand, it damages their whole business. if your business is not related to anything in technology, and maybe getting compromised doesn't really damage your brand as much as your board would think, the budget you're given to do that is much less, right? And I think what's happening right now is the cloud is actually opening this up to everybody and enabling it, because now we went from, oh, it's behind closed doors, it's behind these walls, nobody sees it, we have control of it, to, hey, wait a minute, what is cloud? It's a shared environment. Your systems are running next to his systems, or running next to his systems, or running next to her systems, right? It's not just you being compromised, it's if any of you are compromised, could that vulnerability go below the hypervisor? We have already seen vulnerabilities that have gone below the hypervisor. There was a vulnerability in VMware's floppy driver that all you had to do is boot up a VM and load the floppy driver, and you could go below the hypervisor and actually look and see the other systems on there. Knock on wood, it hasn't happened to a major cloud vendor yet.
You really believe in that?
But when it does, it's going to open up people's eyes when that vulnerability is found, to think, we're all in a shared environment. All it takes is one vulnerability for someone to go below the hypervisor. And that, in turn, I think will change that investment in that methodology, right? So that business that said, my business model is not that public-facing, my brand won't be damaged, well, their brand and their business model is in a cloud platform that can be damaged, and they might actually say, okay, we need to have a bigger budget towards InfoSec and security.
So you're suggesting most organizations say, we'll cross these bridges when we get to them. And I say that there will be no bridge to cross.
Valid point. Mark?
If I had that framework, everything you showed there, what? If I had that framework you just showed up there,
Which you do.
if I had it all operating as you described, what impact would you see on a positive side? What kind of metrics, reduction would you see, and how do you guys express that to us as a customer?
So what I see is, today I think most InfoSec organizations are kind of just running around with their hair on fire, right? Every organization I go in and talk to, I talk to the CIO and the CISO and I go, what are your top 5 things you're trying to solve? And they go, I have these 5 fires. And I go, no, what about roadmap? What are you trying to do? And they go, no, I have these 5 fires that I have to get done right now. They're not necessarily having the freedom to look that far forward, right? This, I think, takes your traditional InfoSec team. So say your InfoSec team is 10 people right now, and 8 out of those 10 people are working on fires, and 2 are working on roadmap. This allows you to now invert that and say, I now have 8 people working on forward-thinking roadmap on projects and integration and being forward-thinking, and my operations perspective and how I execute just got easier, right? Because instead of having to look at 75 plus tools, those tools all talk to each other and roll that data up into a condensed form. And the industry calls it a single pane of glass view, but it's it's a simplified pane of glass view, right? Where all that data is cooperatively visualized for you. Did that answer your question, Mark?
Yep, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.